the Iowa political director for the Gray television stations, and I'm coming up on my 23rd year living and working in this state. Each week here, we are going to talk in depth about some of the biggest issues and the biggest challenges facing the state of Iowa and talk to some key decision makers involved. We're going to start this week with the topic of how do we best protect our kids at school. We know what happened in Perry. It was the first day back from winter break, and a student went into Perry High School and started shooting. He shot and killed a fellow student, along with the high school principal, and wounded 6 others before he shot and killed himself. Since then, communities have been having these deeply emotional and challenging conversations about what to do. Some Iowa House Republicans are looking at a plan that would lay some parameters on arming teachers and staff in public schools. Now, there's an extra part to this. Right now in the general public, as long as you're legally allowed to possess a firearm, you can. You don't have to have any kind of training. That would not be the case when it comes to school. So part of this provision would require regular training, and it could be done with somebody from the Department of Public Safety. I asked one of the lead sponsors of this, State Representative Phil Thompson, a Republican from Jefferson in Greene County, why he would require training in order for a teacher or a staff member to carry at school.
There has to be annual communication training, annual medical training, and as far as the firearms training, that's quarterly, it happens to be, badged officers, they're required twice a year. So it's actually a higher standard for firearms training for these professional permits.
So why require this, whereas the general population not required for you to carry to have any kind of training? Why require it when it comes to schools and school staff?
Well, one, because of the environment, and two, we just want to set that standard, a very high standard. We don't just want to throw this at anybody. We truly want these to be professionals that are capable and understand and are willing to carry out these duties. It is a big deal. And so especially as we offer that qualified immunity to those folks, those professional permit carriers, we need to make sure they're competent. And so, and that's constant. That's got to be constant training and constant reevaluation. And then the other piece of that too is the communication of this is key too. Obviously, we need them to be communicating with those local law enforcement officers that will be the ones responding. So we need to keep them in contact with them constantly, keep those standard operating procedures in place, and to know exactly how to communicate with those folks too.
In June of 2022, the governor had announced that big $75 million commitment to overall security using some of the federal dollars. As you know, it takes a while for things to really get going. So most of the districts don't have that money yet that they've been able to put things in place. How does that previous piece tie into this one once everything's implemented?
So that we have another bill dealing with more security infrastructure, and those funds would tie a little bit more into that one, which it requires them to do a safety evaluation plan. It requires them to have radios that talk to the statewide interoperable radio network. Those funds would correlate more to that for the infrastructure requirements that Representative Norman is spearheading in the House.
For the folks who do not want to see additional guns inside schools, what do you say to them? Where, maybe they hear from law enforcement that, in the heat of the moment, even the most highly trained individuals can really struggle to hit the target. What do you say to those who, frankly, are concerned about any idea about bringing weapons, even from trained staff, inside a school building?
Well, I would say one, code already allows schools to do this. So that is the case currently. This really sets that very high bar for this professional permit, and schools certainly don't have to do this. This, again, just if they're trying to achieve that qualified immunity status, sets a very, very high bar for their training. And two, we want there to be a quick response. And especially where I grew up in rural Iowa, it just won't happen. You really need qualified and willing people on the ground to be able to respond quickly, because we've seen this over and over again in these tragedies across the country. That first 30 seconds is so important. And so having somebody that's qualified and willing to respond to that, it's such a big deal. And to be able to incorporate this other training, the communication with law enforcement, how to pass off a scenario, that and the live scenario training that's required in this too, those walkthroughs are invaluable. So there's just, again, this is a very high standard. We're not just throwing these permits out there. This is a very, very high standard for training for those folks to acquire those permits. And they are going to be qualified, they are going to be willing, and they're going to know how to handle those situations.
Just to build out on one thing you said there, your concern would be, the argument for this is that it just takes too long potentially for a law enforcement to come from elsewhere to come to an active scene. Is that your point? Right.
In the unfortunate scenario we saw in Perry, we saw a 7-minute response time, and that was a very good response time, and we commend law enforcement, but so much can happen in that 7 minutes. And so, having an SRO officer or having, an armed faculty member who knows how to handle that situation, but that 7-minute window, so much could happen. And then thank God, it could have been, these scenarios, just the numbers increase exponentially the longer you give them without a response time. So that's the big thing, is getting a response. The goal is in that first 30 seconds.
Now, they still have to figure out some questions here. Who would buy the gun? What kind of gun would be allowed? Would they be able to find an insurance provider? Because that's been a challenge for the districts that have tried to allow teachers to carry firearms. And where would the gun be all day? Would it have to be on the teacher or staff member, locked in a desk, by the desk? A lot of things districts would have to figure out, and politicians ultimately, as this bill goes through. Another big topic is the economy and the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Goldman Sachs does periodic national polls involving small business owners as part of their 10,000 Small Voices. And a couple of numbers stand out from this. 71% of these small business owners say that inflationary pressures have become worse over the past 3 months. And this is at a time when inflation's been coming down. Now, also, 75% say, though, that they are optimistic about what's ahead in 2024. So you have a couple of different things happening. So we talked to 2 Iowa small business owners, and we had to start with inflation and how they have been and are dealing with that.
We're dealing sort of with 3 things. We've got the inflation, costs of labor and costs of materials are going up. We have interest rates have a huge effect on whether projects move forward and how quickly they move forward. And we also deal with supply chain issues that can again make a project timeline stretch, for years in order to get some specific equipment and supplies.
So how have you navigated with interest rates heightened like they have been the last couple of years, and we haven't seen that ease back down from the Fed yet? Then how do you plan out for that? So you can go through a whole process, but maybe it's on the client side where they're like, I'm not comfortable taking on this big loan, so we're going to back off for a second. How do you plan out for that?
Right. It's super interesting that design seems to be going gangbusters right now. And then the time between when we finish drawings and when a construction project starts has just drastically increased. So people are having a hard time, I think, making that commitment to take on a big loan or invest a lot of equity in construction.
And how does your staffing work? Do you ebb and flow, or do you have a constant number?
I keep a constant number. From a design point, we are still seeing people want projects. They love going through that process. They've got all sorts of big ideas, and then we just have to sort of navigate through the the complex decision-making process to commit to construction.
Well, I would assume everybody keeps looking at that top line borrowing rate thinking, all right, maybe it's going to be this next Fed meeting where they're finally going to back off. But we just had one of those. They decided not to. We'll see what they do in March. But if this pushes on where it's maybe June or something before they start pushing down, do you think it will be, you're going to feel this lag by folks who aren't quite ready to commit?
Absolutely.
Sydney, what about, since you're involved in a couple different levels of production here, how has staffing been for you? Are we to the point now where you, for the most part, can get the folks you need and keep them, or are we not there?
We've been pretty lucky overall in being able to find the staff that we need. But as we're looking towards the future and growing in roles that we maybe haven't had in the past, we are struggling to see kind of where that pipeline is going to come from. We acquired another popcorn company in Sac City, Iowa in 2022. And so that's another area where we've seen staffing looks very different here in Cedar Rapids versus a small town like Sac City. So we're having a little bit more trouble kind of up there, finding the people to keep the line going and to grow that, to additional shifts and what that might look like. But all in all, we've been pretty lucky and we're pretty optimistic about able to fill those positions overall.
And so how do you do that there? Does it help that was an established company in that community and you're not completely starting from scratch? Or what's your trick to navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tricky. I think kind of the important thing to keep in mind is when you are staffing in a small town like that, it's not like there's a bunch of workforce that's not out there doing anything. You're pulling directly from other local companies. And so we're always careful to be cognizant of that.
Now, despite the challenges, both of them say they are optimistic about what's ahead. They think that consumers are hopefully slowly doing better. The supply chain problems are getting better. Inflation should keep coming down, they hope, and the Fed eventually will lower interest rates. You add it all up and they say that would be reason for optimism. Each week, we want to end this conversation with what we're going to call the final fives, 5 quick thoughts about different issues. The first one. What's going on with the AEAs, the area education agencies? Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds wanted some big changes. She put out a plan and then almost immediately had to change it because of all the pushback against it. But now, weeks later, it looks like it's the legislators who will end up coming up with the biggest part of these changes if something ends up going through. House Republicans have been talking over a plan. The Senate's also been working on something. But the way it feels right now, it'll be legislators leading this rather than what the governor originally came up with. So that brings us to number 2 here. And that brings up the question about what kind of political clout does Governor Reynolds have right now? If you remember a couple of years ago, she had tried and failed a couple of times to get those private school scholarships, the vouchers, get that plan through. And Republicans have the majority, but she couldn't convince enough of them to go along with it. So she decided to try to get some of them out of the way. So she was actively campaigning against members of her own party, which really shocked some Republicans I've talked to then and now. For the most part, it worked, and she got some of them knocked out of office in the primary. So then she came back at it in 2023, and she got those private school scholarships through. The AEAs, that plan has been tough so far, and that's why it calls into question, how much juice does she have? Can she still get through what she wants in the same way, or have things changed? Maybe that situation that she went through, booting out members of her own party, also getting involved in the Iowa caucus by going out and campaigning with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis when some other people were favoring Donald Trump. And in the end, her guy lost by 30 points to Trump. So did that damage her some? Or is it as simple as she should have just been sitting down with legislators before the legislative session began, at a time she was out there campaigning with DeSantis and having these one-on-one meetings with key decision makers at the State House to try to flesh out the plan before it went public? Number 3, what happened with this impeachment? All 4 Iowa Republican U.S. House members supported this movement that just barely passed by 1 in the U.S. House to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas for the situation at the southern border. They say that he was not enforcing the immigration laws. Let's see what the lasting impact of this. It doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere in the Democratic-led U.S. Senate, but does this now start a precedent where you're going to see one party impeaching key leaders from the administration if it's the other party? And more broadly, and perhaps more importantly, short term, will House Republicans do anything when it comes to border security, or will they just throw their hands up and do nothing and blame the president the rest of the year until the November election instead of doing something now? Number 4, speaking of Congress, you had this plan that both Iowa senators, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, supported, along with some other Republicans who joined with the majority party, the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, to pass this new aid package for Ukraine as Ukraine fights for its survival after Russia's invasion, something Donald Trump didn't want him to do. And it looks like the Republican-led House isn't going to take this up. But it's interesting that both Iowa senators joined the Democrats to try to push this thing through. Number 5 has nothing to do with politics, but Caitlin Clark has to get a shout out for what she's doing, just dominating, a generational player in women's basketball, the superstar at the University of Iowa. Clearly somebody who can unite people, unlike politics. She can unite people. And as we watch Iowans get behind her, as she's now the all-time leading scorer in women's college basketball history, and to see how far she can push her team as the Hawkeye women move forward.